Hey everyone, my name is Sam Metcalf. I'm the Midlands editor of thebusinessdesk.com, and welcome to our latest webinar entitled Cybersecurity and Remote Working. We're joined today by Mark Lomas, a technical architect team lead at IT and managed services solutions company Probrand. In a few moments, Mark will be taking you through a fascinating presentation aimed at helping businesses ensure that they don't become just another cybersecurity casualty. Of course, cybersecurity is a hot topic at the moment, and whatever systems you had in your offices have had to be exported to home working stations over the last month, and that's made business owners understandably nervous. Today, we'll take a look at some of the ways that hackers are targeting vulnerable businesses and how you can ensure you're as safe as you possibly can be from the different types of attacks out there. We'd like to get you involved, obviously. If you'd like to ask Mark a question, please do, using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll come to those later, and Mark will do his best to answer your queries. Can you just introduce yourself a bit more than I have, Mark, please? Tell us a little bit more about your role.
Thanks, Sam. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Fantastic, and welcome to my kitchen, everybody. It looks like you're in yours as well. Yes, my name is Mark Lomas. I'm a solutions architect at Probrand. I've been with Probrand for about 16 years, 20 years experience in the industry in total. I have a strong technical background. Indeed, I'm a former IT engineer. Used to do a lot of engineering work for Probrand and previous roles. But now I spend most of my time working in a solutions architect role. These days, that has a strong focus on cloud and cybersecurity.
Okay, thank you. Mark, before you start your presentation, just a quick question to set the scene. How much would it be fair to say that, how much has mass home working put a strain on cybersecurity?
Well, as we'll see during the presentation, hackers certainly see this as an opportunity. Any situation where there is change presents opportunity to exploit the uncertainty that can come with that change. And we've certainly seen a lot of that going on. There's been a rise in a variety of different types of attacks. And of course, hackers are trying to exploit some of the human elements of this as well, where confusion through how to access systems remotely might lead people to be clicking on things that maybe they otherwise wouldn't be exposed to.
Okay, Mark, thanks for that. Okay, right, if you want to start your presentation, guys, I think this lasts about 20 minutes. Is that right, Mark?
That's right. Let me just stop my video and get my screen share going. Bear with me.
Okay, and we'll come back to our audience after that for some questions. Okay, Mark, all yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Today, I'd like to take the time to talk to you about cybersecurity. This is a topic that I've spoken about extensively over the last 10 years. It's a common theme that I know many of you will likely be already familiar with. The IT industry spends a lot of its time focusing on cybersecurity, and with good reason, of course. One of the reasons why so much focus is placed on cybersecurity is that it's an ever-changing landscape. The threats and risk profile evolves and changes over time. As such, our response has to evolve with it. Change can come in a variety of forms, of course. Maybe it's change in the nature of the attacks mounted by cyber criminals. Maybe change comes through new systems that we implement in our organizations. Or maybe, as is the case now, it's a change in the landscape of our world. This change comes to us sometimes without choice. We have no say in the matter. And with change comes opportunity. The kind of opportunity that attackers don't hesitate to exploit. But don't worry, however, there are also opportunities for us, as we'll see through the course of the presentation. Now, this presentation is, of course, focused on cybersecurity, so that it's right that we take a moment to just set the scene and review some of the cyber attacks that are occurring. Now, we don't have time today to cover every type of attack being executed, but we can spend a moment to take a look at some key examples. Many of these may be attacks that we're already fairly familiar with, but the risk profile changes due to a very human element, as we'll see. Now, we are, of course, seeing a lot of email-based attacks. The example on the left here, purporting to be from the UK government, offering someone a tax refund. This is, of course, a phishing attack that would take someone to a spoof website requesting personal information and bank details. On the right, an example of an email-borne malware attack, trying to trick someone into opening an attachment that would deploy malware such as a keylogger onto a user's machine. We've seen a big increase in the volume of coronavirus scam email activity. Google alone have pushed out some statistics. They're seeing 18 million scam emails a day, and this was last week on Friday, announced they'd blocked a total of around 126 million scam emails. And of course, that's just Google. Blocks by Microsoft and other email filtering solutions will take that figure significantly higher. Linksys were forced to trigger a password reset of their smart Wi-Fi accounts after users fell victim to malware attacks. And of course, there's real money in these scams. In the US, the FTC has estimated scammers have pocketed $13 million already this year. Most of that is likely to be digitally executed attacks, although of course some will also have been phone scams too. Now, what I'm showing you here is a series of generalized examples of some of the things that are making headlines in the news. But it's also important, of course, to take note of the fact that scammers are very sophisticated. They are sending out blanket emails, yes, but in many cases, they're also sending targeted emails designed to try and entice people in specific organizations. So they'll get targeted where they can as well in order to tailor their attacks to the recipient. Now that we've taken a look at a few examples of the kind of things that are happening out there, let's ask ourselves why we need to consider if this is a concern for us in our businesses. Just what is it that hackers are exploiting to be able to execute these scams or spread more malware? Well, there are, of course, a few things going on. Home working creates new login activity that hackers can exploit. If home workers are accessing remote access solutions, especially if they didn't routinely do so in the past, then how vulnerable might they be to an attack purporting to be from, say, Microsoft, Google, or some other popular service asking them to validate that login activity? There's also increasing potential for email attachment malware, as we saw in the examples. Modify that for a business setting. How likely is it that someone could fall victim if sent an attachment pretending to be from your IT department, insisting that someone needs to install a new VPN client, for example? We might see a higher risk of spear phishing. Attackers attempting this form of attack are banking on the fact that someone might no longer have the same level of easy access to quickly ask someone in the office if a request to pay an invoice is fraudulent. There's going to be increased data sprawl, as I call it, with more and more people transferring, downloading, or emailing business data files. Usually they're doing this for their own convenience, but it can push up the risk of a leak or data breach. Plus, we can of course see an increased use of bring your own device usage from unmanaged home PCs and devices, over which we might have little or no visibility. Now, these are just a few examples of the considerations that we might need to review. What we're really talking about here is the potential for an increase in our risk profile. The risk of financial loss, that could be through scams like spear phishing or ransomware. The increased risk of a data breach. Here we could be concerned with data being transferred to the wrong person or emailed accidentally. We also need to consider a risk to user productivity. It's not just how well our workforce adapts to working from home, but we need to think about what happens if we see disruption through malware attacks. So, how do we keep a lid on that risk profile? In a world where we're seeing high volumes of remote access, how can we manage that? And how can we manage it in a manner that both protects our security and delivers strong workforce productivity? Let's start by having a think about the elements that are actually involved in remote access. People, of course, need to have a device to use to actually get on and work in the first place. This might be a PC or laptop, or even continued use of phones and tablets. And remember, these might not be corporate-owned devices. We might be talking about a user's home PC, and that puts it in the bring your own device, BYOD category. Then users need to be able to connect to the resources they need. That might be via a VPN, remote desktop, or virtual desktop solution. Or we could be talking about resources in the cloud, in which case the type of connection may be much more direct, not requiring a VPN. Then there are the resources themselves, the applications and data that people actually need to work with in order to remain productive. Now, I want to point out that this is something of an oversimplification. Not included in this slide are things like your business processes that you might need to think about and how they can be continued and secured. We're not displaying here anything about customer or partner-facing services and resources. There are a variety of things that we need to review when reviewing our cybersecurity strategy in conjunction with our coronavirus continuity strategy. Nevertheless, if we're going to start somewhere, we need to start with, I believe, these key building blocks, largely because many of the other components mentioned there that we could also be reviewing will often be built on top of these. So what do we need to actually do? Well, what we're really looking for, what we really need, is a combination of robust cybersecurity and strong workforce empowerment. On the one hand, we need to reduce that risk profile that I alluded to before and deliver protection across the three key elements on the previous slide. On the other hand, we're also trying to protect, maybe even improve workforce productivity and empower our workforce to be able to work from anywhere in this case primarily from home of course, using whatever devices they've been providing with or have to hand. Now, I believe these goals are actually integrated in nature, and whilst in the past we might have sometimes have thought of security and convenience as being enemies of one another, I prefer to see security as something as an enabler for convenience, if done correctly and comprehensively. Now, our focus today being cybersecurity, let's review some of the elements that fall under that banner. First, we need to think about the security of devices. If the devices themselves are insecure, then anything the user does with it is compromised by default. So we need to make sure that things like anti-malware, patch management, and device-based firewalls are all functioning. Now, these are the basics, and you'll likely know that to be the case already. But one question that does need to be asked, though, is whether you're able to continue to deliver, monitor, and update that when devices in question aren't routinely connected to the office network anymore. Where are you getting the control and deployment of those solutions? Is it from the cloud or is it from an on-premise server? You might want to look at things like security event monitoring and security intelligence, gathering up information from across your estate, devices used at home, cloud services, applications, whether they be corporate owned or personal devices, and having robust insights into all of that, into the security health of your devices. Speaking of which, health attestation is also important. Before access to corporate resources permitted, you need to know the security status of those devices that are being used to access those resources. If you don't, how could you be sure that you're not exposing yourself to an increased risk? Identity protection, this also covers things like the login processes. We're wanting to ensure that for our workforce logging in to corporate resources on those devices, that everyone is who they say they are. It's not just the devices and logins that we need to protect, though. In a highly distributed scenario like the one we face today, we also need to protect our data wherever it goes. We can't just rely on the fact that the device being secure somehow also makes the data secure. It doesn't. Remember, you have to give users a certain amount of freedom to work with the data. That alone exposes the possibility that through simple human error, data could land in the wrong place with the wrong person. Worse still, if the device security does fail for any reason and we don't have the safety net of data security, then the increased likelihood of a breach could occur by malicious action. So we need to think about information protection. That might mean applying data sensitivity labeling, allowing, in turn, policy-driven management of data flow to be applied. We can bring in data leakage prevention and data governance. This allows us to reduce the likelihood of information and data being shared with an unauthorized person. We might bring in communications compliance monitoring. This lets us review events where inappropriate or policy-breaching data sharing or discussions about data take place. And of course, data encryption. Whilst many of us may be used to the concept of whole disk encryption on devices, file level encryption is also just as important and can be tied in with the sensitivity labels mentioned above. Ultimately, the primary advice here is to secure your key asset, your data. It's your data you need to protect, and to do that, you need to secure it wherever it goes. There's never really one central silo for data. Data is highly mobile. It's constantly being accessed, transferred, cached, so protect it as such. So, to review some tasks for our IT departments, let's think about a few areas where we need to adapt. Let's break it down into three key areas: device onboarding, application provisioning, and of course, security. Now, security plays an important role across all three of these categories, as we'll see. However, it's important to remember that many of the elements that we're discussing here all tie in with one another. It's important to note that whilst we're focusing on cybersecurity here, we could also just as equally be focusing on workforce empowerment. The same modern management techniques for provisioning resource access in a secure manner are also concerned with delivering that access to the user in a simple, convenient way on any device in any location. This helps ensure your workforce have access to all their resources whilst reducing the risk profile. Let's start by talking about device onboarding. Many of you might already be familiar with this today, but it's useful to recap. Legacy techniques like manual onboarding of devices or imaging already carried with them many challenges. Creating images in the first place, keeping them updated over time, reviewing them for different device models. There are plenty of headaches. Then add to that the logistics challenge. This is now especially apparent. How do you provision devices when there's no longer a physically centralized IT department to actually work on enabling a machine for use? Zero-touch onboarding techniques can help. Through solutions like Windows Autopilot, Apple Device Enrollment Program, or Android Zero Touch, we can have a factory-fresh, vanilla device shipped straight to an end user, even at their house. And we can do this with the confidence that when the user powers that device on for the first time, it will automatically set itself up, register itself in our corporate directory, enroll itself into our corporate management solution, and even install and apply all of the software and configuration profiles we need it to have. In an environment we face today with so many people working from home, it's a much more streamlined approach for device onboarding. Even after we emerge from lockdown, it's likely that an increased number of users will work from home permanently, and these sort of techniques make a lot of sense, both for those users and on-premise office-based devices. The security element here is that such devices are essentially locked into your corporate control systems, allowing you to enforce the management controls necessary to deliver protection with a higher degree of confidence. Now, let's move on to the second element of talking about application provisioning. There are a few components to talk about here too. First, you need to be the one that's in control of application delivery. And what I mean by that is you need to have solutions of your own in place for application deployment. It should never be on the end user to install software. Thus, everyone should be aware of the fact that if someone asks them to manually apply anything to their machine, that's something to be questioned. Such solutions should allow you to push software to devices for access by users, at least in the case of client applications. Thus, users need rely less on manual intervention by a support team and know that they have the applications they need. That needs to span both desktop and laptop PCs, but also other devices like Apple and Android phones and tablets. Preferably, provide a single digital workplace for users to access their applications. This is, of course, able to help with ease of use and workforce empowerment, as it makes things much more predictable and simple from your staff. However, it will also improve security as we're able to fully control access to that digital workplace with a singular focus. That digital workplace can bring together both cloud apps and on-premise applications as well. Solutions like application proxying or per-app VPNs can alleviate the need for traditional remote access and VPNs. And this brings me to point 4. We can integrate with this techniques like single sign-on and multi-factor authentication for our applications. This helps significantly improve identity protection. And we can go further by utilizing things like conditional access techniques to integrate with security health attestation to prevent access from devices that are compromised or not compliant with our policies. Finally, provide secure solutions for BYOD devices as well. They too must be given access to the digital workplace, but also must be security verified. Simply allowing logins from any device without first carrying out this validation will only serve to maintain a higher risk profile. Now, of our 3 elements, security has many components, of which we'll cover just a few here. First, thinking about the devices themselves, be sure you can push security components to these devices. Components like anti-malware, firewall controls, patch management configuration, etc. However, go further by gathering information back from those devices. You need to be able to monitor what the security health state of those devices are. This is especially true if you're looking to take advantage of health attestation and conditional access. You need to know if the device is in a suboptimal security state if you're to reduce or minimize the access that is then granted to that device in order to keep your risk profile down. This applies equally to BYOD as it does to corporate-owned devices. You want to take a zero trust approach. Remember, there's no perimeter here, nor can we just trust that devices are secure. If you were previously relying on an on-premise component to control and monitor devices, then you might need to look more towards cloud solutions. This could include cloud identity management, enterprise mobility management, and unified endpoint management, to name a few. Some people might look towards always-on VPN solutions here to keep devices in contact with the corporate data center. However, I would suggest that cloud solutions are still more likely to be robust. Remember, all the major operating system vendors, Microsoft with Windows, Apple with iOS, Google with Android, have built the relevant cloud management and security components directly into their operating systems. For identity protection, again, I just want to reiterate single sign-on, multi-factor authentication. This applies regardless of whether you're delivering applications in the cloud or on-premise. Conditional access too is important. If you're able to validate the security status of the user, the device, the application, then you can use that information to automatically determine if you're going to allow access based on rules you decide. A simple example of a rule here might be determining which countries you allow login from. If you don't routinely operate business abroad, then you could lock it down to just the United Kingdom, or a list of countries that you do operate from or travel to. More sophisticated rules could validate things like the firewall, antivirus, even the version of an application or operating system running on a device to confirm that it's up to your policy level before allowing access. For data security, as previously mentioned, you need to look at securely wrapping your data in such a way that the security you need for that data follows it wherever it goes. Permissions just at the central repository aren't enough. Look to evaluate if compliance controls need to be implemented. Your data protection or compliance officer will want to take a hand in this, and it will be important to have written policies in place that define what your sensitive data is and how you expect your workforce to handle it. You can then turn to implementing technological controls to help enforce those policies. Finally, try to guard against rogue data repositories. You want to minimize the use of personal storage solutions like consumer cloud options where possible. That might mean taking further advantage of operating system level protections to secure against data whilst it's being accessed. It will also mean that as much as possible, your own solutions are the ones that people look to for data storage. You need to implement solutions that are just as easy to access as those consumer options so that users don't experience frustrations that might drive them to look elsewhere. Now we're coming to the end now, so I want to offer my final key takeaway, which is this. Your data is your critical asset. Treat it as the digital element that it is. It can go anywhere, and the security must follow it wherever it goes. Keep in mind that your infrastructure may be secure, yes, but you do need to allow people access to that data to do their job. It's my view that this is actually an opportunity. If we deliver data to users in a manner that's secure, so that the security follows that data wherever it goes, then we can have a higher level of confidence in making those solutions convenient and easy. And thus we can deliver workforce empowerment too. That's my presentation for today. So with that, I'll hand back to Sam. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mark. If you want to put your video back on, Mark, we can see you as I'm asking some questions. That was fantastic. Thank you. Comprehensive. Again, just to our audience here, if you've got any questions for Mark, please do use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Mark, when you sat at work in the normal world, if you remember that, if we had an IT problem or a cybersecurity problem, we'd pick up the phone or we'd go into another office and have a word with somebody. A lot of staff are used to thinking this is someone else's job. Now they're sat at home. It's not anybody else's job apart from their own, is it really, to pick up on these things? So how do business owners go about changing the mindset and what role does training have in that?
Yeah, there's a few different elements and components here. Obviously, we are fighting a constant battle when it comes to cybersecurity. Microsoft themselves are, fully acknowledging of the fact that security is something that they're constantly having to battle with. And we're not just talking about, fighting bugs. We're talking about the kind of attacks that security, that malicious actors are trying to execute on. And what we really see here is a regular change in the way in which these attacks are executed. So Microsoft, for example, they executed what they called a sandbox for looking at attachments in email, what they called their own detonation chamber. And for that, what they were able to do is kind of build their own little sandbox there for how they examine email attachments that come through. And what they did with that is sort of say, okay, we've got this detonation chamber. When we're looking at attachments, we can sandbox them, execute them, see what activities are going on. And then if it is malicious activity, we can do something about that. Then they spotted that the hackers themselves were wising up to the fact that Microsoft were running this detonation chamber and started trying to find ways to get around it. So it is an ever-evolving battle. And that's why, you sometimes see things that do slip through the net with, email filtering solutions. And so there needs to be a degree of awareness with staff as to what to look out for in an email, what they should be thinking. Hang on a minute, is this something that I should be clicking on, or have we got something a bit weird here? At the same time, there's also other responsibilities that we do have to place on our staff, particularly when it comes to how we handle data. It's our data, it's our information, but it might also be information that pertains to personally identifiable information, information that's from our staff, our customers, our partners, suppliers. There's all sorts of things that might be confidential. So staff need to be aware of how to handle that. We can put in place controls to help with the security of that data, but we also need to be mindful of the fact that staff need to be aware of their handling responsibilities. And that's where things like written policies come into place. And so there's got to be that training element around cybersecurity and cybersecurity awareness. There's got to be training around compliancy and policy awareness. These kind of things do need to come into the mix.
Okay, I've got a question from an audience member here. This person runs a small business. He wants to know what sort of costs are expected when securing data.
Yeah, so there's a variety of different things to go into here. Obviously, there are certain key elements that will be in place regardless of the size of the organization. The basics that I alluded to. You have your antivirus. There could well be a cost associated with that. You have your patch management solutions. There's probably going to be a cost associated with that, whether it's a specific patch management solution or whether it's something that's being run in the cloud as part of a bigger service. You have your firewall solutions. Now, that might be a firewall baked into the operating system, but how are you monitoring and controlling that? Again, that might be a cloud service that requires some sort of cost associated with it. And then there's the other element of this that I alluded to in the presentation, the actual data security. So you're securing your devices, you're securing your infrastructure, you've got those building blocks in place, and then you're securing the data with information protection technologies. Maybe you're labeling your data, maybe you're encrypting it. Now, in some cases, you might be able to get all of that all in one place. So you might find a cloud solution that includes all of these components that you'll need, or at least a huge number of the basics. You might find that you can sign up for a cloud service that's going to give you enterprise mobility management, that's going to give you information protection, that's going to give you monitoring, that's going to give you identity protection, that it's going to give you all of that in one place, in which case you might find that you can bundle a lot of these things together to help keep some of the costs down, rather than having lots and lots of separate solutions, all of which carry their own implementation costs as well, all of which carry their own design elements. So by bundling it together and looking for a single solution that kind of includes a lot of the components that you need, you might be able to keep a lid on the costs there. Of course, when we are looking at cloud solutions, we are looking at a subscription-based model. It is a sort of per user per month approach. But of course, the advantage of cloud is that you're always up to date. And that's not just, what great new features are you getting in the software that you run on your PC. It's also that, as mentioned, because security is a constantly evolving model, that you've got a service there that is also evolving and keeping pace all the time as well.
Okay, and is there any difference in offering protection from sort of Android and Windows as opposed to Mac-based systems, or not?
All of the same kind of components have to come into play. So most modern management systems these days, we look at things that would refer to themselves as enterprise mobility management or unified endpoint management. They're all going to have the capabilities to control a broad range of operating systems. Go back in time 10, 20 years when Microsoft introduced the original paradigm of Active Directory and group policy. They were concerning themselves with Windows, and that was it. That was all you were really able to look after. But that was fine, because in most organizations, that was the primary thing that they were working with. Times change, and even Microsoft have changed. They're a lot more open than they used to be. And so these days, their modern approach in the cloud, things like Intune, for example, will quite happily look after multiple platforms. Now, whilst those platforms expose different controls and different mechanisms, a lot of the same kind of key building blocks are there of being able to manage and monitor the device, being able to apply security controls onto the device, being able to make sure that you can implement those data protection policies, and that when you're accessing data, regardless of the platform, that the same kind of security and compliance technologies are available to you, and that you can validate that. So one of the things that you might want to do in your EMM platform is set a few rules and say, okay, we want to make sure that we can validate that a device is running those basics, that the antivirus is working, that the firewall is working, encryption's turned on, a password or a PIN or biometric security is required. And if all of these rules are met, which are pretty reasonable expectations, then we allow access. If any of these rules aren't met, we can flag the device as non-compliant, and we can say, okay, that the risk of this device is a bit high. Maybe if the antivirus software isn't running, well, how do we know that the antivirus software is stopped running because of, what's the difference between it not running because some malware has managed to sneak in versus some error and it's just stopped working? You don't really know until you remediate that device. But in the meantime, that device carries a higher risk profile. And that doesn't matter regardless of whether it's Windows, Android, Mac, iOS. It doesn't matter. If there's an increased risk profile, you need immediate action. Otherwise, you're just creating a bit of a gap there in which things can happen that you don't want to happen.
Yeah. Okay. I guess it's been, what, 4 weeks now since we've all been living in this strange kind of world. And I guess, there's been different type of threats come forward over that time. If you have a look over the last 4 weeks, are there any sectors which have been particularly vulnerable, do you think? Or any sectors that, conversely, that seem pretty airtight?
I wouldn't say that I could peg down any particular sector as being higher risk or lower risk myself. Everybody is sort of carrying different risk profiles depending on the nature of their organization, of course. But there's a lot of common themes that occur across a lot of different sectors. So as mentioned towards the start of the presentation there, hackers are looking to exploit the fact that everyone was kind of out of position. Everybody sat from home, logging on from in an unfamiliar way. If they're not used to working from home on a regular basis, creates the space for someone to come along with some spoof email that says, hey, click here to validate your login. That's the kind of thing that we start to see. Or, hey, here's the latest VPN client, please run this. Of course, we've got loads of different people all trying to log in from home, people having to scramble to implement remote access solutions and remote working techniques. And of course, that creates that space where there's confusion, there's that room for people to come in and say, okay, well, that we can exploit that. We can exploit the processes that people are having to go through. People were having to ramp up remote access solutions that might have been sized in the early days, in our sort of old normal, would have been sized for an environment where you only had a small percentage of people working remotely at any one time. Now you've got like a much higher percentage, maybe 100% of your workforce working from home all the time. So there's a huge difference in that, and you have to implement new solutions. There's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of installation activity going on. Hackers come along and they try and exploit that. And at the same time, there's that convenience factor of how people are gaining access to solutions. Is it good enough, or is it a really robust solution that works well and provides simple and convenient access? If it's only good enough, you tend to very quickly find that if you're not in control, that your end users will sort of start to fill in the gaps. They'll start to share access to data by just emailing attachments around. And one of the big things that we see, even in normal times when we're looking at cybersecurity, is that human error is way up there as one of the biggest cybersecurity threats when it comes to data breaches. I think someone did some research last year and got some statistics out of the ICO, and something like 60% of the data breaches that were being reported to the ICO were down to just human error, just people emailing files to the wrong place, sending it to the wrong place. A big chunk of those were down to people faxing data to the wrong number. And that's where we started to think, okay, these solutions that you think might be secure, like a fax machine, it's not on the internet, so it's secure. And it's only secure as the person operating it. If they fax it to the wrong place, the wrong number, well, you could have just given away some data to someone that shouldn't have that. So this is where you sort of say, actually, the technical solution, well, it could provide you a more secure approach if you put in place the right controls.
Okay, a couple of quick questions here, I guess, that you'll be able to answer fairly rapidly. From Nigel, is there a website we can go to see the services provided by cloud server providers compared against one another so we can choose the right provider?
Compare the market against people. I guess I'm not sure if I have anything to hand right now that I could point you towards to compare and contrast different cloud providers. It kind of falls into a couple of different categories. Obviously, you've got your core kind of key productivity providers that are out there. Obviously, the two big ones that you can name straight away are going to be Google and Microsoft. Google have got their G Suite, Microsoft have got 365, and they're both out there kind of battling for the hearts and minds of business, enterprise, education, public sector. They're all out there trying to promote that. So your core productivity cloud suites are going to be coming through those kind of providers. When it comes to the security elements, well, this is where you start to go into the world of figuring out what all needs to be integrated together, because certainly you can sign up for certain plans from, say, Microsoft that are pretty comprehensive. But if you're looking for something different, you can, of course, choose whatever enterprise mobility management or whatever unified endpoint management provider you want. You know, Microsoft, Google, Android, Apple, ultimately all of the APIs and management techniques for security that they've built into their operating system, well, they're pretty open. You know, they're fairly open these days. It's not locked down so that only Microsoft can manage Windows and only Google can manage Android, etc. No, you can choose whatever provider you want. So you could go to VMware and use Workspace ONE. You could go to IBM Mass 360. You could use SOTI. There's a whole range of different solutions out there for enterprise mobility management. But what a lot of these guys have in common is that they're all really taking advantage of what's baked into the operating system. So an enterprise mobility management solution, it's not able to do anything that the operating system can't. They're taking advantage of what Microsoft are baking into the operating system itself, and what Google and Apple are baking into their operating system platforms. So you have the choice when it comes to productivity solutions, those core productivity suites. You have choices when it comes to enterprise mobility management and unified endpoint management. You even have a choice these days for directory services. Again, things like Active Directory. It's not necessarily the only game in town anymore. You know, Azure Active Directory there is there, of course, but there are other providers out there trying to vie for your directory services business. So there's a variety of different options when it comes to that. And when it comes to other third-party cloud applications, of course, for line of business applications, for example, there's obviously a whole range of different solutions out there. But this is where that single digital workplace comes in, because regardless of what other products and services you sign up for your finance package, for your CRM package or ERP solution, for your HR solutions, for expense management, you know, you're going to have a variety of applications, both big and small, that you use in your organization. Having them all tied into one central portal so that users don't need to remember a plethora of different URLs and logins. They can just go to one place, gain access to the application, and by tying it into that single portal, you can then front it with single sign-on. Users don't have to remember multiple passwords if it's just one. Bit easier to convince them to use a secure password. Multi-factor authentication, you can provide that for all of those applications because it's tied into one place. And again, conditional access. So regardless of what choices you make, it can all be tied into one place. So to go back to the original question, no, I don't have a sort of market comparison site that I can talk to you about there. Yes, there is a lot of choice, but I would suggest to start with your core productivity service. What are you going with there, whether it's Microsoft, Google, or maybe something else, and have a look at the kind of capabilities, because those guys can offer you quite a lot of capabilities when it comes to cybersecurity.
Okay, you mentioned passwords there. There's a question here from Sally. What is your view on users saving passwords in Chrome or Apple Keychain? Is this high risk?
Generally speaking, both Apple and Google are wanting to try and encrypt and secure that data so that there's a degree of protection here. There have occasionally in the past been one or two security bugs that have been found in these kind of password storage vaults. And Apple and Google are not the only ones. You know, most browsers have the ability for you to say whether or not you're storing the password in the browser's cache. Windows has got its own credential manager service built in, again, to let you save passwords. Of course, any of these kind of services can be subject to a bug, and that if the device or in some way the browser is compromised, that someone could potentially steal those passwords. Of course, they've got to exploit that bug. And then they've got to rely on the fact that, you know, Apple and Google, you know, they're going to race to patch those kind of things pretty quickly, because anytime any big credential manager like that is hacked, that's going to create a big story. You know, that's going to be the sort of thing that starts to get reported on in the security press, maybe even mainstream press in their technology sections, because it's going to be quite bad news if a big system that caches everybody's passwords is then compromised. So most of the time those things are fairly secure, and most of the time the vendors of the relevant products will try to make sure that they're patching those things pretty damn quickly if a bug is found. Thankfully, most of the time when vulnerabilities are found, they're usually found by security researchers first rather than hackers. And in those circumstances, security researchers will usually be fairly graceful in telling the software vendor, hey, look, we've found this security bug. You probably want to fix this. Because they will release that information to the public. They will make it publicly available knowledge. Of course, there are circumstances where hackers get wind of a security vulnerability first, and this is where you start to see things like your zero-day attacks, where they start attacking this thing straight away and not really give anybody much room to maneuver. In general, though, most of these security keychain and password vaults are generally fairly secure. They're fairly pretty well encrypted. The vendors tend to keep very much on top of patching these things, so they're usually fairly reliable. But again, when it comes to storing passwords, I would say that it's usually a good idea to make sure that you always consider passwords to be an attack vendor, an attack vector, because hackers, they're going to go after these things by phishing attacks to try and get you to enter your password into a spoof website. They're going to go after this through brute force attacks. It's a vector, and it's the reason why we say use multi-factor. If there's only one thing you do from an identity management protection perspective, turn on multi-factor authentication. If you've got Google, it's just baked in. You don't have to pay anything extra to have MFA. You just need to turn it on. If you've got Office 365 or Microsoft 365, it's now being rebranded, you've got multi-factor authentication, turn it on. You can have that protection enabled. So it's a very easy way to dramatically increase your identity protection by turning those capabilities on.
Okay, Mark, time's nearly beaten us, but we've got a question from John, which echoes my last question to you, really. Hi, John. John owns a small business that he's looking, he says, to survive and stabilize. He's asking, what is the best way to move forward, given the many issues and solutions you've highlighted? So, in layman's terms there, Mark, what's the best thing for small business owners to do now?
There's a couple of different things that we can look at here. It sort of depends to a certain extent on whether the bulk of the applications involved for a small business are on-premise, if your data is still on servers in an on-premise environment, or whether or not your data and applications are up in the cloud. Now, if you're on-premise, you're probably going to be looking towards remote access solutions as your main approach for gaining access to your applications and your data whilst people are having to work from home. So this is an area where you want to improve and enhance the security you have, maybe at the remote access point. So for example, if you've got some sort of VPN solution, or maybe you've got an SSL VPN portal. So if you're going to an SSL VPN portal, for example, where people can just go to a website, log in and gain access to things, then I think the main thing that I would say there is, do you have the ability to implement some sort of multi-factor authentication? Again, people stealing passwords is the easiest way for a hacker to get in, because then they don't need to do any hacking. They just get your password. They're just stealing your login. And that's the easiest route in the world for a hacker to go down. So can you implement multi-factor authentication and plug that into your remote access appliance or remote access solution in some way? If you can, I would definitely talk to your provider and ask that question and say, can we get some sort of multi-factor authentication to improve security? Another thing to do is just generally educate your staff, because everybody should be suspicious of any emails that they receive that say, hey, I need to validate your login, or I need you to install this attachment. Anytime anything like that comes through. So try to build awareness with staff as to what they can do. The second thing around that is really to be thinking about what devices are people using to access your applications and data. Is it a laptop that you've provided them with, or is it a home PC that they're having to use? When you're talking about a on-premise environment with devices that you own, most of the time they're going to be connected back to a server. So the status of those devices can be maintained relatively well over time. The moment those devices fall off the network, unless you're sure that they're on the VPN on a regular basis, then sooner or later you're going to start to have less control and less management and visibility over the security of those devices. And that's where I guess we sort of turn our attention to the long term. We've got our solutions that we've scrambled to implement now, and we want to try and make sure that they're as secure as possible. But what happens tomorrow? What happens next month? What happens next week? As we move forward, how do we make sure that we're getting the best level of security? And if previously we were reliant on an on-premise environment and now everybody's working from home, it may be time to evaluate cloud. Now, if you are already in the cloud, it's a case of sort of just making sure that some of those security capabilities that I mentioned are basically just turned on. Again, multi-factor authentication. I can't stress that enough. You know, if you're in Office 365, if you're in Google, multi-factor authentication, it's just included in your subscription. So get that turned on. Ask your provider to help you if you need a bit of assistance there, and they'll help you get multi-factor authentication enabled for your users. And then that way, that's just going to increase the level of security you have quite a lot, because again, if people steal a password, that's an easiest thing in the world for hackers to do. It also means that if possible, you can take those corporate owned devices and kind of just do a little bit of reconfiguration to mean that they're being monitored and managed in the cloud rather than through your on-premise server. Doesn't mean that you have to sort of like, you know, ditch your on-premises stuff, because that takes time to do a bit of migration and a bit of work there. But for a lot of cloud solutions, and again, Microsoft have these, other providers have these as well, you have the ability to take your PC, and if it was sort of hooked up and joined into your on-premises servers for logging on, for management, for security, well, now you can hook it up and join it to the cloud so that you can manage and monitor these devices wherever they are. You're not even dependent on a VPN anymore to do that. As long as those devices have got an internet connection, then that cloud service can check in with them, monitor them, make sure they're secure. And then you can start to turn on things like conditional access. And again, in some of the subscriptions for some of these cloud services, that'll just be included as part of the plan. So being able to turn those capabilities on helps you improve security. So we can start to roll better and better security over time by implementing more and more of these features. And those same features, as mentioned in the presentation there, can also be used to help deliver good workforce empowerment so that people can carry on working. You know, other things that, you know, people will have scrambled for two things. One, remote access. How do I get access to my data? Two, how do I keep my people in touch with one another? And there are, of course, going to be more and more ways as you move to the cloud to help embrace more and more of those components and keep people collaborative and productive. Okay,
Mark, thank you. Comprehensive, indeed. Thank you so much for today, Mark. I'm sure that everyone's found that really useful. Thank you to Probrand for sponsoring today, and thank you to everyone for logging on.